This is Hanan Mudaffar, and this is part of a series of lectures highlighting the main ideas in Pelagia Goulimari's book, Literary Criticism and Theory, From Plato to Postcolonialism. This session is on Chapter 8, Decentering Modernisms, Newness, Tradition, Culture, and Society. The chapter outlines the evolution of 20th century literary criticism in Britain and beyond, focusing on its shifting engagement with culture, tradition, institutions, and modernity's discontents. It opens with early modernist figures like Eliot and Richards, whose ideas helped shape the discipline's foundations, and moves towards later voices in post-colonial feminist and cultural studies that radically reimagined these foundations. Throughout, the chapter traces how literature became a contested site of ideological, political, and aesthetic struggle, reflecting broader transformations in history, society, and thought. Modernist critics sought to define literary value and continuity at a moment of rupture, collapse, and accelerated change, where inherited forms no longer seemed adequate. Later figures challenged this cultural consolidation, reshaping the canon to include suppressed traditions, marginalized voices, and alternative interpretive frameworks. The institutionalization of English studies, particularly within British and colonial educational systems, shaped these critical battles by tying literary theory to pedagogy, governance, and cultural authority. The chapter ultimately reveals a double movement, canon formation and canon critique, as essential to understanding literary history's evolving claims to value. Literature's cultural authority was both defended and dismantled, often by the same thinkers whose work laid the groundwork for future transformation. T.S. Eliot's Tradition and the Individual Talent redefined poetic creativity as the product of deep historical absorption, not a spontaneous act of personal expression or emotional self-disclosure. He insisted that the poet must acquire the historical sense, a perception of past and present as coexisting, and surrender individual originality to the continuity of a cultural inheritance. Eliot's concept of tradition was not mere repetition or reverence for the old, but a living system in which each work subtly reshapes the entire body of existing literature. At the center of this system stood a distinctly European canon, hierarchical, exclusionary, and overwhelmingly male, which Eliot nonetheless promoted as a universal cultural framework. He demanded impersonality in artistic creation, likening the poet to a chemical catalyst that facilitates transformation without leaving a trace of individual identity. This analogy, drawn from chemistry, leaned into metaphysical abstraction and revealed Eliot's signature fusion of scientific method and religious or mystical sensibility. The poem, in his view, should be emotionally intense yet critically detached, channeling passion into disciplined form and avoiding personal indulgence. Eliot's theory of tradition offered a powerful lens for evaluating literature, but also functioned as a gatekeeping mechanism bound up with questions of cultural prestige and authority. His impersonal model of poetry served simultaneously as a critique of romantic expression and as a subtle defense to literary elitism cloaked in intellectual rigor. Eliot's canon reshaped the discipline of literary studies, reviving 17th century metaphysical poets and marginalizing much of the Victorian and Romantic tradition that had dominated previous generations. He admired the intellectual agility and tension in poets like Donne and Dante, but dismissed figures such as Shelley and Tennyson as overly emotional, diffuse, and lacking structural discipline. Romanticism's emphasis on personal experience, imagination, and interiority ran counter to Eliot's classical preference to balance, impersonality, and order. Yet Eliot's dismissal of Romanticism was strategic more than consistent, as he occasionally drew on its aesthetics, particularly its lyricism and symbolicism, even while publicly denouncing its values. His criticism aimed not simply to interpret literature, but to refine cultural taste, positioning the critic as a kind of legislator of moral and aesthetic standards. The concept of the objective correlative exemplified his belief that emotion in art must be rendered through an external structure or image to avoid excess or sentimentality. He lamented what he famously termed the dissociation of sensibility, blaming post-17th century poetry for splitting intellect from emotion and thus weakening literary unity. This critique served as both a historical diagnosis of poetic decline, and a normative prescription for the qualities good poetry should strive to recover. However, his authority as a critic rested heavily on rhetorical force and cultivated intuition rather than a transparent or reproductive method, which gave his judgments an aura of profundity but also opacity. His reshaping of the canon was monumental, but it established boundaries that excluded women, colonized writers, and experimental voices, limits that later critics would expose and challenge. As Eliot's critical writing matured, his focus shifted from questions of poetic form and impersonality to broader concerns with cultural cohesion, religious authority, and the role of the critic in society. In the function of criticism, he elevated the critic to a figure of cultural stewardship, responsible for forming common principles that could unify judgment across disparate works and readers. However, Eliot never explicitly defined what these principles were or how they should be agreed upon, leaving his theory vulnerable to ambiguity and charges of authoritarianism. His later work, especially in Notes toward the Definition of Culture, proposed a hierarchical society where cultural vitality depended on the preservation of elite traditions and cultivated minorities. Culture, for Eliot, was no longer merely a matter of artistic excellence, but a comprehensive social organism requiring careful maintenance against the threats of mass culture and democratic leveling. This vision positioned literature as a stabilizing force, linking aesthetic values to religious orthodoxy, social order, and resistance to cultural fragmentation. While Arnold had earlier celebrated culture as the pursuit of perfection, Eliot imagined it as a spiritual and historical inheritance endangered by modern pluralism. His preference for order, continuity, and liturgical cohesion marked a decisive turn away from the experimental impulses of early modernism. In these later writings, the critic emerges not as an explorer of meaning, but as a guardian of civilization, echoing rather than challenging dominant norms. Eliot's legacy had inspired divided critical responses, with some viewing him as a revolutionary modernist and others as a reactionary conservative retreating into religious orthodoxy. Critics see a decline from early radical innovations to later ideological rigidity, especially after Eliot's conversion to Anglicanism and embrace of social hierarchy. Other critics interpret Eliot's trajectory as a gradual evolution from metaphysical idealism toward hermeneutic historicism, revealing a more flexible and context-aware thinker. These divergent readings mirror tensions in Eliot's own writing, where mysticism and logic, universalism and exclusivity often coexist uneasily. His work remains notable for its simultaneous commitment to high aesthetic standards and its suspicion to the modern world's fragmentation and relativism. Even in The Wasteland, with its broken voices and collage structure, Eliot seeks a spiritual coherence beneath the ruins of meaning. Later poems, like Four Quartets, reflect this shift explicitly, as personal faith becomes the foundation for poetic unity and cultural commentary. Ultimately, Eliot's enduring power lies in the complexity of his critical and poetic imagination, which continues to provoke, polarize, and inspire re-examination. I.A. Richards advanced a new kind of literary criticism grounded in psychology, focusing on how poetry mediates emotional and intellectual experience. In Principles of Literary Criticism, he argued that literature helps coordinate conflicting impulses, bringing internal balance and clarity to the reader. His vision of poetry was therapeutic, not escapist, but corrective, offering a space for imaginative exploration and moral development. Drawing on, but not bound to, contemporary psychology, Richards aimed to articulate how readers respond to literature on multiple cognitive and emotional levels. Unlike Eliot's impersonal model, Richards emphasized process and function over tradition or cultural hierarchy. He believed that literary training was vital to mental health in a modern world saturated by distraction, misinformation, and moral uncertainty. His criticism promoted disciplined attention, encouraging readers to understand literature not just as art, but as an instrument of ethical and psychological education. This educational mission aligned literature with democratic ideals, making aesthetic cultivation a civic as well as intellectual responsibility. In practical criticism, Richard tested his theory by analyzing how students interpreted unfamiliar poems without contextual guidance. The results exposed common interpretive flaws, stock responses, oversimplifications, and over-reliance on personal opinion, which he saw as obstacles to genuine understanding. These findings reinforced his belief that critical reading required formal instruction, not just instinct or exposure to good literature. He emphasized four interrelated components of poetic meaning: sense, tone, feeling, and intention, as tools to cultivate clarity and precision. Richard's goal was not to prescribe fixed meanings, but to train perspective flexible readers capable of navigating complexity. In an age of mass communication and ideological manipulation, he saw close reading as a form of mental discipline and cultural resistance. His pedagogical approach democratized criticism by enabling non-specialists to engage literature analytically without requiring historical or classical expertise. Although later theorists would critique its neutrality, Richard's method remains foundational in classrooms that value critical thought and textual engagement. Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own challenged both the literary canon and the entrenched socioeconomic barriers that historically exclude women from cultural production and recognition. She famously argued that women required financial independence and personal space, both literal rooms and figurative freedom, to write and create on equal footing with men. Through the imagined life of Shakespeare's sister, Woolf dramatized how institutional and cultural inequalities extinguished female genius and distorted the record of literary history. Rather than merely seeking entry into existing traditions, Woolf called for a new lineage of women's writing that would express different values, priorities, and modes of storytelling. Her concept of the androgynous mind, drawing from Coleridge, imagined a creative consciousness free from rigid gender roles, capable of full artistic synthesis. Woolf's irony, elegance, and refusal to mirror the authoritative tone of male critics made her a foundational figure in the emergence of feminist literary criticism. Her work laid crucial groundwork for later challenges to patriarchy, authorship, and aesthetic authority, reframing literature as a space where personal creativity meets structural resistance. William Empson's Seven Types of Ambiguity expanded the practice of close reading by directing attention to the layered nature of poetic language and the instability of meaning. He treated ambiguity as the lifeblood of poetry, not a flaw to be eliminated, but a creative force that enriched interpretation and rewarded careful analysis. Empson combined a technically precise eye with a willingness to embrace interpretive uncertainty, relying on detailed examples rather than abstract frameworks. Unlike Eliot or Leavis, who often linked literary value to moral or cultural authority, Empson avoided ethical judgment, focusing on how meanings formed, overlapped, and occasionally contradicted one another. His critical voice was empirical yet idiosyncratic, often irreverent towards academic orthodoxy and driven by a deeply intuitive responsiveness to language. In later works, Empson became more polemical, sharpening his opposition to rigid evaluative systems, particularly those exemplified by Leavis's prescriptive canon. Though not overtly political, Empson's defense of ambiguity implicitly challenged the hierarchical structures that sought to impose singular meaning or exclude complexity. His legacy remains central to literary studies as a champion of pluralism, contradiction, and the intellectual freedom inherent in interpretive labor. F.R. Leavis positioned literary criticism as a morally serious practice grounded in the belief that great literature refines judgment and affirms essential human value. He admired Eliot's rigor, but rejected his theoretical framework and emphasis on cultural hierarchy, preferring literature grounded in lived moral experience. Leavis defined a great tradition of English novelists, Austen, George Eliot, James, Conrad, and Lawrence, whose work displayed intelligence, ethical depth, and vitality. Literature, in his view, served as a repository of a civilization's most serious efforts to grapple with the nature of life and human responsibility. He believed that readers must be carefully trained to recognize moral seriousness and imaginative vitality in text through close and evaluative reading. Leavis was deeply suspicious of popular literature and mass media, which he saw as threats to intellectual and cultural integrity. His criticism championed felt life and embodied responsiveness to human complexity that resisted abstraction and aestheticism. Through his journal Scrutiny and his work at Cambridge, Leavis institutionalized a critical method that was austere, combative, and fiercely committed to standards. His evaluative style inspired devotion and controversy, leaving an indelible mark on mid-century literary education. Even as later critics rejected his exclusions, many inherited his conviction that literature matters urgently to ethical and cultural life. Leavis's vision of cultural renewal depended on a highly selective literary tradition that privileged depth, discipline, and moral seriousness. He excluded much of modernist experimentation, dismissing writers like Joyce or Woolf for lacking what he considered essential engagement with life. D.H. Lawrence, by contrast, became his exemplar of literary greatness, an author whose visceral intensity and ethical insight offered a powerful alternative to aesthetic detachment. Leavis's canon was narrowly defined and deeply resistant to pluralism, omitting not only popular forms, but also women, colonized writers, and alternative traditions. His rejection of relativism hardened into dogma, as literary value was increasingly determined by adherence to his own critical criteria. Despite these exclusions, Leavis's belief in literature as a civilizing force helped solidify its place at the center of education and public discourse. His legacy is one of both intellectual passion and critical limitation, at once a defense of cultural standards and a refusal to recognize difference. Although Eliot shaped Leavis's early literary values, Leavis eventually broke from Eliot's emphasis on impersonality and his later religious conservatism. He grew critical of Eliot's tendency toward abstraction and cultural orthodoxy, which Leavis believed deflected literature from the lived experiences it should confront. In contrast, Leavis found in D.H. Lawrence a writer who engaged passionately with life, emotionally, ethically, and socially, without evasion or retreat. Lawrence's conformist heritage, connection to working class life, and spiritual intensity made him a compelling counterpoint to Eliot's theological elitism. Leavis saw Lawrence as a prophet of modern vitality, someone who affirmed life's complexity rather than sublimating it into aesthetic order. For Leavis, Lawrence did not merely describe moral crises, but lived them in his prose, confronting modernity with raw psychological insight. This made him, in Leavis's view, a writer of supreme cultural importance, far more engaged with real ethical challenges than Eliot's more aloof sensibility. Thus, Lawrence supplanted Eliot as Leavis's central figure, not just as artist, but as a moral force rooted in English dissenting traditions. Leavis exerted lasting influence on mid-20th century literary pedagogy, elevating the role of evaluation and moral seriousness in English studies. His insistence on life, felt experience, and intelligence shaped how students and teachers approach literary texts across decades. However, Leavis's narrow scope and refusal to embrace plurality became increasingly evident as literary criticism diversified. He largely ignored women writers, dismissed experimental modernists, and excluded non-European voices as irrelevant to his canon. Despite his opposition to mass culture, his own judgment often reflected upper middle-class biases he left unexamined. His vision of the great tradition hardened into a rigid orthodoxy, where dissenting literary values were routinely rejected. While claiming to reject dogma, Leavis's critical method became prescriptive, marginalizing texts that did not meet his criteria of moral weight. Still, his call for seriousness in reading and teaching helped preserve literature's academic centrality in an era of shifting cultural priorities. Leavis left behind not only a canon, but a style of critical engagement, ardent, polemical, and deeply committed to literature's ethical significance. Raymond Williams radically redefined literary criticism by embedding it within the broader dynamic of social, economic, and institutional life, challenging the notion of literature as an isolated or purely aesthetic activity. In Culture and Society, he traced a lineage of British thinkers from Coleridge and Carlyle to Orwell, who responded critically to the emergence of industrial capitalism and its cultural consequences. Williams coined the term cultural materialism to describe how literature functions within and is shaped by ongoing historical processes and evolving class structures. Rejecting Eliot's partisan elitism and Leavis's exclusionary moralism, he called for a more democratic, inclusive notion of culture grounded in the collective experience of ordinary people. He famously redefined culture not as the pursuit of refinement or timeless artistic standards, but as a whole way of life, encompassing daily routines, belief systems, and social practices. For Williams, literature was never autonomous or transcendent. It always emerged from and intervened in material conditions, economic pressures, institutional settings, and ideological frameworks. His focus on labor, social relations, and historical specificity provided a powerful alternative to formalist approaches that separated text from context. Williams helped transform literary studies into a politically conscious field, laying crucial groundwork for the development of cultural studies as a critical and interdisciplinary practice. Williams believed that working class values, cooperation, mutual care, and shared responsibility should serve as the ethical foundation for democratic culture and criticism. He critiqued what he called the dominative mode of bourgeois society, which imposed individualism, hierarchy, and market logic on cultural life. Against the nostalgia of earlier critics, he rejected romanticized visions of rural England and insisted on confronting the realities of industrial modernity. His ideas of culture was expansive and open-ended, rejecting fixed canons in favor of evolving collective expressions of meaning and identity. While deeply informed by Marxist thought, Williams resisted crude economic determinism, offering a nuanced view of the interaction between base and superstructure. For him, culture could not be reduced to ideology. It was also a space of lived experience, contradiction, and possibility. His insistence that literature must be evaluated through its relevance to social processes made him a pioneer in bridging criticism with activism. Williams' model reshaped literary studies into a project of social inquiry, attuned to both historical context and political urgency. In 1968, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, alongside Taban Leong and Henry Awer Aniyomba, authored a bold manifesto calling for the abolition of English department at the University of Nairobi. They argued that literary education in Africa should center indigenous languages, oral traditions, and regional literatures rather than European canonical texts. This critique challenged the deep colonial imprint left on educational institutions where English literature functioned as a tool of cultural domination. Ngũgĩ later enacted this decolonization personally, rejecting his Christian name and writing in Gikuyu to recover linguistic agency and cultural continuity. He viewed literature not as a static artifact, but as a mode of political engagement capable of resisting imperial narratives and restoring collective memory. His focus on oral storytelling affirmed community over individualism and emphasized the performative, participatory dimensions of cultural expression. Ngũgĩ's work helped catalyze the post-colonial turn in literary studies, insisting that language, politics, and pedagogy are inseparable. Chinua Achebe's 1975 lecture, An Image of Africa, delivered a forceful critique of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, exposing the novel's deep-rooted racism and its complicity with colonial ideology. Achebe argued that the narrative dehumanized Africans by rendering them voiceless, nameless shadows whose silence functioned to elevate European consciousness and superiority. He challenged the literary establishment's long-standing tendency to excuse or overlook such portrayals by framing them as products of their historical moment or as complex narrative voices. Conrad's stylistic brilliance, Achebe contended, did not neutralize the text's ideological violence, but instead cloaked it in literary prestige, making it all the more insidious. By insisting that moral and political responsibility must accompany literary interpretation, Achebe radically redefined the criteria of greatness in literature. His critique forced teachers, critics, and institutions to reconsider the racial and cultural assumptions embedded in canon formation and curricular design. Achebe's intervention was not a plea for token inclusion, but a demand for the transformation of critical standards based on justice, voice, and epistemic accountability. His work helped to solidify postcolonial studies as a field and opened the door for deeper critiques of Western literary traditions from formerly colonized perspectives. In Subculture, The Meaning of Style, Dick Hebdige examined British youth culture, punks, mods, skinheads, not simply as social phenomena, but as sites of symbolic resistance within late capitalist society. Drawing on semiotics and Marxist cultural theory, he interpreted music, fashion, hairstyles, and slang as aesthetic strategies that disrupted dominant cultural narratives and social norms. These subcultures, he argued, engaged in bricolage, reassembling mainstream cultural symbols in subversive ways that created new, resistant meanings from everyday objects. Hebdige's analysis revealed how marginalized groups articulated dissent not through overt political protest, but through coded, stylized practices embedded in the routines of daily life. Although these styles were often co-opted and absorbed into the mainstream, their initial disruptive power lay in revealing the instability and fragility of hegemonic ideology. Rejecting conventional literary evaluation, Hebdige treated subcultural style as a form of visual text, fluid, performative, improvised, and historically specific. In doing so, he framed subculture as legitimate forms of cultural criticism, responding to class-based exclusion, racial tension, and generational frustration. His work extended literary and cultural criticism to include the ephemeral, the visual, and the material, challenging the primacy of written text. Hebdige's method helped institutionalize cultural studies as a discipline that values multiplicity, resistance, and the expressive politics of everyday life. Stuart Hall, a central figure in British cultural studies, advocated for a flexible, historically situated approach to theory that resisted fixed categories and universal claims. He argued that theory should remain open-ended and responsive to political struggles, functioning less as a doctrine and more as a strategic resource. Influenced by Gramsci's concept of hegemony, Hall emphasized that culture operates through negotiation and consent, not simple domination. He brought together Marxism, post-structuralism, feminism, and postcolonialism in what he called articulation, a practice of connecting ideas without collapsing their differences. For Hall, culture was not a reflection of economic base, but a site where identities, ideologies, and resistances were constantly reconfigured. His work challenged both traditional literary criticism and economic determinism, promoting a dialogic model grounded in complexity and contradiction. Hall's legacy lies in his commitment to thinking conjuncturally, recognizing that cultural meaning emerges from historical specific intersections of power, discourse, and everyday life. In literary theory, Terry Eagleton traced the institutionalization of English literature as a response to political unrest and social upheaval. He argued that the rise of English as a discipline in the late 19th century aided to instill moral values in the working class and prevent revolutionary consciousness. Literature, according to Eagleton, became a vehicle for teaching obedience, civility, and national identity under the guise of aesthetic cultivation. English replaced classics not to democratize education, but to offer an ideological buffer against socialism, feminism, and secularism. He critiqued the Newbold Report and university extension programs as mechanisms for disciplining rather than liberating the masses. Eagleton's tone was polemical, but his analysis revealed how literary study had often served as an instrument of soft power. Yet he did not reject literature altogether. Instead, he insisted on a critical theory that recognized literature's complicity with ideology while exploring its emancipatory potential. His work reoriented literary studies toward political awareness, pushing questions of power, class, and resistance to the center of the discipline. By the 1990s, critics began dismantling the narrow canonical definition of modernism associated with the so-called men of 1914, Eliot, Pound, Joyce, and Lewis, whose dominance had shaped the field for decades. The idea of a singular, elite, Euro-American modernism gave way to plural, overlapping modernisms that included feminist, regional, working class, and post-colonial expressions of aesthetic experimentation. Scholars began to recover neglected writers such as Dora Neale Hurston, Jean Rhys, and Mina Loy, whose innovations had taken place outside the major literary institutions and canonical narratives. New periodizations emerged that extended modernism's timeline and situated it within longer global processes of cultural production, migration, and resistance. Cultural historians traced how modernism was not merely a Western phenomenon, but one deeply shaped by transnational movements, colonial entanglements, and evolving media technologies. These revisionist projects revealed how earlier accounts of modernism had systematically excluded voices based on race, gender, class, sexuality, and geography. In place of a unified aesthetic rupture, modernism came to be understood as a field of diverse, contested responses to the challenges of modernity, situated in a wide array of cultural contexts. Contemporary modernist studies continue the work of decentering by resisting narrow definitions of artistic value and embracing complexity, contingency, and multiplicity. Critics now examine modernism through transnational frameworks, exploring how it intersects with colonialism, migration, and global literary networks. Feminist and postcolonial scholars have reinterpreted canonical texts while foregrounding marginalized voices that were long excluded. Modernism is no longer seen as a monolithic aesthetic movement, but as a heterogeneous field shaped by overlapping cultural, historical, and political forces. This shift has expanded the archive to include media forms, oral traditions, and hybrid genres often dismissed by earlier critics. Scholars now study the infrastructures of modernism, publishing networks, salons, and universities as active agents in shaping literary meaning. Decentering also extends to method, encouraging a more reflexive and ethical form of criticism attentive to positionality and power. The field has moved beyond preservation towards critical reinvention, where tradition becomes a resource rather than a constraint. Modernist studies today is defined less by unity than by a shared commitment to openness, plurality, and historical accountability. This chapter traced a century-long transformation in literary criticism, from Eliot's impersonal classicism to global pluralist modernist studies. It followed key figures who shaped, challenged, and redefined the canon and the process of criticism and the purpose of criticism. From Leavis's moralism to Williams's cultural democracy, from Woolf's feminism to Hall's theoretical synthesis, critical thought evolved. Postcolonial and cultural studies forced literary institutions to confront their exclusions and reimagine value. Critics like Ngũgĩ and Achebe decentered Europe, asserting new literary and cultural paradigms. Modernist studies today embraces heterogeneity, connecting literature to politics, history, and identity. Across these shifts, the central question persists: what does literature do, and who is it for? Thank you for your attention.